The gala lights were blinding, but the words were worse. I stood there, tightening my tie, holding the expansion contract for my stepdaughter's startup, a final $1.2 million infusion that would have doubled my already massive exposure. My wife, Teresa, leaned in and whispered, "Caleb, you need to sit in the spare seat behind the stage for the cover photo. Trent is here, her real father, and the magazine needs the bloodline to look authentic. You understand, right?" I looked at Alyssa. She just gave a nod, refusing to meet my eyes. I didn't argue. I simply folded the paper. If you had spent 17 years building a house for someone else, only to be told you weren't family once the roof was on, would you stay, or would you let it collapse? Trent looked like the hero I had built. He stood under the spotlights in a $3,000 suit, his easy grin suggesting he had personally paved every inch of the road that led to this stage. I watched from the shadows of the side stage wings, my back against a cold brick wall. For 17 years, I had been the invisible scaffolding for their lives, the silent partner, in a family business where I was the only one contributing capital. I was the one who answered the phone at 2 a.m. when Alyssa was stranded in a parking lot. I was the one who sat through every parent-teacher conference while he was finding himself in another state. 10 years ago, I had even authorized a payment of $400,000 to settle a legal mess Trent had made, purely to keep his image clean in his daughter's eyes. I wanted her to have a father she could respect, even if I had to buy him for her. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant. I had become an architect of a dream that required my own erasure to function. Love is sometimes a blurred mirror. We look into it to see what we want to see, until the reality of a spare seat finally wipes it clean. I realized then that I hadn't been building a family. I had been funding a subscription where they were the only users and I was the only one footing the bill. At the time, I thought I was being patient, but I was really being trained to accept less, trapped in a psychological cage of my own making, a survivor's chain forged from the very roof I had provided. I had just authorized the transfer of $1,200,000 as an angel investment for her startup, believing that my role as the provider was the foundation of our bond. But as Teresa laughed at something Trent whispered, her hand resting on his arm, the truth became clinical. I was a luxury they had overdrafted for years, an insurance policy they no longer felt they needed to pay premiums on. They didn't see a father or a husband in the shadows. They saw a liquidated asset. I felt a strange, icy stillness settle over me, not the heat of anger, but the cold clarity of a balance sheet that finally made sense. I wasn't just sitting down something heavy. I was preparing to hand it back to the people who had spent a lifetime dropping it on my feet. I looked at the contract in my hand, the ink barely dry, and understood that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you simply stop cooperating. Teresa didn't apologize when we got home. Instead, she poured a glass of expensive wine, bought with my money, and handed me a leather-bound folder. "Caleb, we need to finalize the board structure for Alyssa's startup," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. I opened it to find a waiver of voting rights. She wanted me to hand over my controlling interest to Trent. She was betting that my silence would continue to protect Trent's criminal record from the other investors, effectively asking me to become a partner in a board-level deception. Her logic was as flawed as it was predictable. Trent was the biological connection, the one who gave the brand its authentic soul. She truly believed that my 17 years of investment were just a down payment for his eventual return. Watching her, I realized she was suffering from a profound psychological dislocation, the trap of normalized cruelty. For years, I provided so much that she had stopped seeing the source of the flow. She had confused having with being. She lived in a house worth $2 million, drove a $100,000 car, and managed a charitable foundation I had endowed, but she had come to believe those things were part of her skin, not a loan from mine. She felt powerful because she held the checkbook, forgetting that I was the one who kept the balance above zero. Money can buy a seat at the table, but it cannot buy the grit required to keep it when the foundation begins to shift. It's about Alyssa's legacy, Teresa continued, pacing the floor. Trent is back now, and he needs a voice in her future. It's a blood right, Caleb. I looked at the document. It was a strategic request to liquidate my remaining authority. She assumed I was too invested in the family image to ever walk away, a sunk cost fallacy she intended to exploit to the last cent. She saw my silence not as strength, but as compliance. I won't be signing this, I said, my voice as level as a ledger line. She stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. The mask of the grateful wife slipped, revealing the entitlement underneath. You've always been so transactional, Caleb, she spat. This isn't an investment opportunity. It's about your daughter. Step, daughter, I corrected gently. And the investment has already reached $1,200,000. She slammed her hand on the mahogany table. If you don't do this for her, then don't bother calling yourself her father ever again. Choose now, are you a parent, or are you just a banker? She left the folder on the table and walked toward the bedroom, confident that the emotional debt she had manufactured would force my hand. I didn't follow. I simply picked up the folder and felt the weight of it. It was the moment I realized that some roofs are held up by nothing but habit, and it was time to see if hers could stand without me. The attorney's office smelled of old paper and silence. I sat across from my personal lawyer, a man who had spent 30 years translating human messes into ironclad paragraphs. I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted a strategic liquidation of my involvement. I handed him the startup agreement for Alyssa's company, the one I had signed as the lead angel investor. We didn't talk about the betrayal at the gala or the spare seat behind the stage. We talked about the breach of fiduciary trust clause. Because Teresa and Alyssa had attempted to alter the board structure and voting rights without my written consent, they had triggered a specific provision I had insisted on 4 years ago. I wasn't just pulling the $1,200,000. I was withdrawing my personal guarantee on their commercial lease and their line of credit. In the world of high-stakes business, a personal guarantee is the gravity that keeps a startup from drifting into space. Without mine, the entire structure was about to lose its weight. The process wasn't instantaneous, which made it feel more real. There was a legal friction that required patience. My lawyer informed me that the bank would require a formal 30-day review period before the accounts were fully frozen. 3 hours after I left his office, my phone began to vibrate. It was the lead underwriter at the bank, his voice tight with a professional anxiety he couldn't quite mask. He asked if I understood that a withdrawal of this magnitude would likely force the company into a technical default within the week. I understand the terms of the contract I wrote, I told him. I realized then that true justice doesn't come as a lightning bolt. It comes like a meticulously audited financial report. It is quiet, it is detailed, and it is undeniable. I was no longer seeking a domestic reconciliation. I was conducting an audit of my own boundaries. For 17 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family, a venture that had finally proven itself to be insolvent. I felt a profound sense of relief as I watched the underwriter's name vanish from my screen. I was no longer holding up a roof that was never meant to shelter me. By the time I sat down for a late lunch at a quiet corner bistro, the machinery of consequence was already grinding forward. I knew the bank would be notifying Alyssa's office by the end of the business day. I also knew that Teresa would assume this was a bluff, a temporary tantrum that could be solved with the same emotional manipulation she had used for 2 decades. She was still operating under the illusion that my capital was a permanent fixture of her landscape. But when the first notification of default hit her inbox, she would realize that the banker had closed the vault and walked away with the keys. Truth is a jagged thing to hold. I didn't send Alyssa a frantic text or an emotional email. I sent a professional courier. Inside the plain manila envelope wasn't a fresh infusion of capital, but a photocopied record of an old transaction, a copy of a cashier's check for $400,000, dated exactly 10 years ago. The memo line didn't say gift or inheritance. It was the final settlement of a criminal restitution case that would have sent Trent to federal prison for a very long time. I remember the night I signed that original check. Teresa had begged me to save him, not for Trent's sake, but to protect the image of the man Alyssa called Dad. I paid for his freedom and his silence, on the condition that he disappear and let her grow up without the shadow of a convict hanging over her. He didn't return now because of a sudden surge of paternal instinct or a biological pull. He returned because he had exhausted the last of that $400,000 and needed a new venture to liquidate. What stayed with me wasn't the argument, it was the silence after. Only later did I understand what that moment of mercy really cost me. I wasn't just paying a debt. I was funding the very lie that would eventually be used to displace me. Truth is not a weapon for attack, but a light to liberate those living in the dark cave of deceit. I wasn't trying to destroy Alyssa's world. I was simply giving her the ledgers she had never been allowed to see. I was tired of being the silent ghostwriter of her family's fake history. What stayed with me wasn't the sum of the money, but the hollowness of the man I had subsidized. Trent was a professional at performing a role he had never earned. He was happy to accept the credit for her success, just as he had been happy to accept my money to avoid a prison cell. By evening, I knew Alyssa would have opened that envelope. She would be looking at the signature on that check, my signature, and the date that matched the year her hero had allegedly gone on a spiritual journey abroad. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the gala. It was the silence of a structure where the main load-bearing wall had finally been removed. Teresa called me at 6:42 p.m. Her voice no longer smooth, but shrill, with a panic that sounded like a declining market. She didn't ask about my day. She asked how I could be so cruel as to tell Alyssa the truth. I didn't answer. I simply set the phone down and watched the sun set over the harbour, knowing that the authentic soul of their brand was about to face its first real audit. The bank's confirmation arrived at 11:51 a.m. It was a short, clinical notification stating that my personal guarantee had been officially removed from Alyssa's corporate accounts. I watched the digital dominoes fall from a safe distance. Without my credit score and 17 years of financial history backing her, the startup was no longer a disruptive force. It was a high-risk liability. The underwriter didn't hesitate. They lowered her credit line by $800,000 within the hour. I realized then that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you simply stop cooperating. For years, I had provided an invisible safety net that allowed them to be reckless. Now, the net was gone. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, 2 of her secondary investors, men who only signed on because they trusted my reputation, called an emergency session to discuss their exit strategies. They weren't interested in Trent's authentic soul or biological bloodlines. They were interested in the $1,200,000 that was no longer anchored to the company. The boardroom was where the final act of their play fell apart. I wasn't there in person, but my lawyer's summary was vivid. Alyssa and Teresa had walked in with Trent, expecting to use their majority board seats to officially oust me. They were still riding the high of the gala, still believing that my capital was a debt I owed to their lineage. But when the bank representative stood up and explained that the company's primary line of credit was tied to my personal liquidity, not the brand, the air left the room. Trent was the first to realise the well was dry. He didn't stay for the questions. He didn't even look at Alyssa. He just walked out, leaving her to face the angry vendors and the mounting debt. I watched the security footage later. He didn't even stop to pick up his coat. It was the quickest liquidation of a father figure I'd ever seen. He didn't leave a note. He just reverted to the ghost I'd been paying to haunt someone else's life. Back at the house, Teresa was still trying to maintain the facade. She had ordered new furniture for the living room, a $3,000 sofa she expected me to pay for. When the delivery men were turned away by the new owner's security team, she finally broke. She called me, her voice cracking under the weight of a reality she hadn't prepared for. "You can't do this to us, Caleb. This is our life." "No," I said, my voice as steady as the tide. "This was my life. You were just the guests." I had already accepted an offer from a young family who saw the house as a beginning, not a trophy. I gave Teresa exactly 21 days to vacate. It was a strategic withdrawal, not a dramatic explosion. When the glossy finish of my money was stripped away, the structural integrity of their world was revealed to be non-existent. Their version of family was a house of cards that required me to be the floor. I can admit now that I felt a profound sense of lightness as I watched the moving trucks arrive. I wasn't losing a home. I was finally resigning from a role I had never been permitted to outgrow. Teresa's messages became a barrage of escalating demands, but the tone had shifted from authority to desperation. She was finally realizing that my silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of completion. I didn't reply to her 24 missed calls. I just looked at the empty rooms where I had spent 17 years making myself small, and I realized that the only person who had been sitting in the back row the whole time was me. I found peace in the grain of cedar wood. I had moved to a quiet town on the coast, 3 hours away from the noise of Austin and the toxic atmosphere of my former life. I rented a small cottage with a detached garage that I converted into a workshop. For 17 years, I had built a mansion for people who wanted the master suite but didn't want the architect at the dinner table. Now, I was building birdhouses. They were small, precise, and required a level of focus that blocked out the lingering echoes of Teresa's voice. Alyssa found me 6 weeks after the bank had finished the liquidation of her startup's assets. She didn't arrive in a Mercedes this time. She arrived in a taxi, looking like a woman who had finally been forced to walk on the ground she had previously looked down upon. She had been forced to sell the intellectual property of her company to a competitor for a fraction of its projected value, a few $100,000, just to cover the payroll taxes and the outstanding commercial lease. I was no longer guaranteeing. She was no longer a CEO. She was an employee at a mid-level marketing firm, living in a one-bedroom apartment that she'd had to qualify for, using her own modest salary and a security deposit she'd struggled to pull together. "You're hard to find," she said, standing at the entrance of my workshop. I didn't stop sanding the roof of a cedar birdhouse. That was the intention. She looked around at the sawdust and the simple tools. "Mom is living in a 2-bedroom condo. She's working as an office manager for a non-profit. She says you won't answer her emails." "I've finished that audit, Alyssa," I said, finally looking up. "There's no remaining balance to discuss." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mixture of shame and a lingering, desperate hope for a rescue. "I didn't know about Trent. I didn't know you paid that $400,000 10 years ago. I thought he left because he didn't love me." I realized then that this was the justice of a planter. True justice isn't about burning the field, it's about what you choose to plant once the weeds are gone. I had spent 17 years protecting her from the truth, thinking I was being kind. In reality, I was just preventing her from developing the emotional muscles required to survive the world. By revealing the truth, I hadn't destroyed her father. I had destroyed her dependency on a lie. "He left because he was a liability," I said clinically. "I paid to remove that liability. That was a business decision I made for your benefit. The gala was a business decision you made for his." She asked for a loan, just $50,000 to clear some personal debts Trent had left in her name. I told her no. I let the word hang in the air between us, as immovable as stone. It was the hardest word I've ever had to speak, but I wasn't being cruel. I was finally being consistent. I told her I would no longer be her banker, but if she wanted to send me her new business plans, I would review them as a mentor for a fee. I was using the $1,200,000 I had recovered, to establish a seed fund for blue-collar entrepreneurs. People who knew how to build things with their hands and didn't expect a front-row seat they hadn't earned. It was an investment in character, not bloodlines. Alyssa stayed for an hour, but for the first time in our 17 years together, the conversation wasn't about what I could do for her. It was about the reality of the bills she was now paying and the work she was actually doing. She looked at me before she left and asked if I would ever come back. I looked at the structure I had built with my own hands that morning and realized I was already home. The tide does not ask for permission to return. It follows a law far older and more reliable than any family promise I ever received. I sit on my porch now, watching the grey waters of the Gulf Coast move with a clinical precision that I have come to admire. It has been 6 months since I walked out of that gala in Austin, and in that time, the silence has become my most valuable asset. For 17 years, I believed that if I provided enough, if I built the houses, paid the tuitions, and filled every financial gap Trent left behind, I would eventually earn a permanent seat at their table. I thought I was being patient, a man of character holding a family together. I can admit now that I was simply a silent investor in a venture that had been emotionally insolvent from day one. I wasn't sacrificing. I was engaging in servitude without acknowledgement. The $1,200,000 I pulled from Alyssa's startup was never just money to me. It was 17 years of my life, liquid and cold. When I revealed the truth about the $400,000 I paid to keep Trent out of prison a decade ago, I wasn't seeking a gotcha moment. I was simply correcting the ledger. I had spent too long ghostwriting a hero's story for a man who was nothing more than a recurring liability. Alyssa's visit to my workshop confirmed a psychological truth I had long suspected. Some people only recognize the value of a foundation once the house starts to lean. She didn't come to me because she missed me. She came because the insurance policy had expired and the storm had finally arrived. I felt a twinge of the old instinct to reach for my checkbook, but then I looked at the cedar wood in my hands. I realized that letting go of a toxic bloodline is not an act of cruelty. It is a courageous act of self-preservation. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, but in the world of high-stakes trust, blood can also be a mask for exploitation. I chose to stop being the invisible scaffolding. I chose to stop sitting in the back row of my own life. Today, the $1,200,000 I recovered serves a different purpose. It funds the Caleb Preston Seed Fund for blue-collar entrepreneurs, men and women who understand that respect is earned through sweat, not through a biological accident. Looking back, that spare seat behind the stage wasn't an insult. It was a departure gate. It was the universe giving me the final piece of evidence I needed to close the file on a life that was never truly mine. There is a peace that comes with realizing you no longer have to fix things that refuse to stay intact. If you are the one currently footing the bill for a family that only calls you when the debit card bounces, or if you've been moved to the back row by the very people you've spent a lifetime protecting, I want you to remember something. You do not need their permission to be seen. You do not need to stay under a roof that doesn't shelter you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a man can do is put down the weight he was never meant to carry and walk out into the open air. That is enough. That is courage. I've shared my ledger with you because I know I am not the only one who has ever felt like a ghost under his own roof. Have you ever reached a point where you had to choose between your bank account and your dignity? What was the moment that finally made you walk away?